are gained. So, like I said, Ukraine nuclear, Russia soldiers advance in Ukraine nuclear agency reports that the Russian military forces have subsequently seized the Zaporizhzhia facility. So the Zaporizhzhia facility in Ukraine was seized by Russian soldiers. As you know, Russia President Vladimir Putin can now direct threaten the safety of all Europe. So let's go into let's talk more about this with Bloomberg News.
This is, in many ways, the second Cold War.
We are coming out of a pandemic, and now we are going into another shock.
Worst case scenario, oil continues to rise and we hit 150. You're going to get an inverted curve.
The Fed is in a very tough place here.
Go too fast, they risk stagflation. Go too slow, and 7.5 and rising, inflation can become entrenched.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Live from New York City for our audience worldwide. Good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Live on TV and radio. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Futures down 8 or 9/10% on the S&P. TK stunning pictures overnight.
About 7:30 last night, we all saw it as war in real time, John. I mean, I'm sorry, the digital revolution, the social media and all makes it so damn immediate. We saw that last night, the good news of a fire out. But what I see this morning, John, is a real weekend balance sheet adjustment, even with the Russian markets closed, and you see it with euro on the cusp of a 109 handle.
Away from the market just for a moment. If you're just waking up this morning, let's go through this piece by piece. So overnight, a nuclear plant in the southern part of Ukraine came under attack by Russian forces. A fire broke out at a training complex at that plant. We understand that fire has now been contained. Some of the headlines that we understand this morning from the IAEA, they informed us this morning, no change in radiation levels. That is really important, Tom. Also, we learned that it has not affected essential equipment. We do know, however, Tom, that Russian forces are now in control of that site. Any additional headlines, of course, Tom, we'll keep bringing them to the audience through the morning.
This is coming north out of Crimea, which has been the real thrust here of the Russians. And to me, John, the real headline here is we're all on a learning curve, is that this is a nuclear-powered country. There's a lot more other reactors to come if the Russians continue to advance.
Getting response worldwide to this, Lisa. This from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. It just demonstrates the recklessness of this war and the importance of ending it.
That's, I think, the sentiment pretty widely held throughout the world, especially because this power helps to generate a lot of the crops to grow, a lot of the necessary commodities that come out of this nation, in addition to the 44 million people who live here. But we are finding out, even if there has been some sort of disaster averted, as was warned by some of the Ukrainian officials, what does this mean going forward in terms of ramping up the conflict and taking steps that really haven't been taken before? And we're seeing that from Vladimir Putin.
Lisa, today there is a NATO ministerial meeting. Secretary Blinken will be attending that. This is clearly for many people an escalation overnight coming into this morning. How are we expecting them to respond to it?
Honestly, that's a really great question, because how far can they go without hurting themselves, or at least incurring more of the pain, which they've been reluctant to do? We certainly hear that from President Biden. However, members of Congress have a very different message. You can see the splintering right now of people who want to go as hard as possible on sanctions, and others who even want to take additional steps.
So live pictures streaming in last night as that started to happen. Equity futures rolled over. Let's whip through it for you. We snapped back a little bit, but futures are still negative on the S&P. We're down by 0.8%. On the week coming into Friday, the S&P 500 only down 0.5%. Tom, in Germany, the DAX is down almost 9%. And go through some of the banking names. They've lost a quarter of their value this week in 1 week alone.
That's so important, John. The idea here, yes, there was a snapback of U.S. real 10-year, came back nicely off near a negative 1.00, but that doesn't tell the story of the balance sheet adjustment I see underway again into the weekend. You see it across every nation, front and center in Europe.
Lisa, go bank to bank. Raiffeisen down about 26% this week. SocGen down 24. Deutsche Bank down 21. It has been brutal for these names.
How do you measure not only the potential fallout from the Russia sanctions, but also from commodity prices increasing to such a degree and slowing growth? How do you factor in some sort of stagflationary environment to banking statistics right now, let alone anything else. One thing we have not mentioned so far is that today is the payrolls Friday, and yet that seems to be completely lost in the conversation because does it even matter at a time when there seems to be a greater existential threat? Yet at 8:30 a.m. we do get that U.S. February jobs report. It is expected to come in as a deceleration at 423,000 versus the 467,000 of January. I'm watching, frankly, the average hourly earnings, which are expected to increase yet again to a new high on an average basis going back a decade, not including some of the disruptions during the pandemic era. But again, how much does this matter as you try to offset some of the increases that you're seeing in gas prices, in aluminum prices, in wheat prices, and all the other commodities that have been affected? At 1:15 p.m., Secretary of State Antony Blinken is going to be joining that NATO meeting that you were talking about, John. He's going to be speaking to press in Brussels, talking about some new sanctions. Yesterday, he said these individuals, the ones that were sanctioned, the oligarchs, part of President Putin's inner circle, have enriched themselves at the expense of the Russian people, and their support has facilitated Putin's war of choice against Ukraine. Okay, that's nice. Now, what about those oil sanctions? That's what everyone's going to be talking about today, in addition to additional steps. And Saturday, China very much in focus, and China matters for the Ukrainian situation as well. They're beginning the National People's Congress with a speech outlining economic goals. They're expected to ratchet back their estimated GDP to between 5 and 5.5%, which is the slowest since 1991. But, John, honestly, I'm curious to hear what they're going to say about Ukraine. How much are they going to start to step more into this conflict, since they have been amazingly quiet with respect to their previous alliance with Russia?
Lisa, thank you. Team coverage starts right now. Bloomberg's AkaNature in Poland, Maria Tadeo in Brussels, Belgium, and Emily Wilkins here in the US down in DC. Aggie, just to begin with you, stunning footage overnight. We were all gripped by that. What have we learned so far this morning?
Hi, John. So it's important to state that this nuclear reactor, this nuclear plant, when it went on fire last night, it was a training facility, as you mentioned at the top of the show, that had caught on fire, and now it is under Russian occupation. However, the material in the nuclear plant is deemed to have not been affected. What is important to note, however, is that this is also showing the progression of Russian troops from the major urban center that they managed to capture in Kherson, and this is going up the Dnieper River, 230 kilometers up to where this plant is located.
Aggie, good morning from New York. I'm curious into the weekend, the belief that the Russians will turn west at some point.
I think it's difficult to say right now. It's clear that they have been pushing a lot into the south of the country, and there have been talks about where they would go next. But I think that this is also important to see that President Zelensky of Ukraine said that he saw that what has happened overnight with this attack on this plant, it should be a wake-up call to Europe, that this is something that if anything were to go wrong in any one of these conflicts on the ground, this could be a serious concern for the entire continent of Europe.
Maria Tadeo, we have NATO ministers meeting today in Brussels, talking, I'm sure, about what the next steps are, as this is deemed very much an escalation. What's on the table?
Well, Lisa, of course, everyone here was concerned after the footage, and the message that I've gotten from officials that are already at NATO headquarters in Brussels is that A, they were shocked, shivers when they saw the footage, but two, a very clear message that Vladimir Putin is now playing with fire, but two, we have to be very careful about not escalating on that front. I had an official that told me, if you look at everything that's happened over the past 48 hours, he's escalated militarily. We've seen what happens with the Russian bombings from the air to the ground, but then two, you see that Russia keeps bringing up the nuclear aspect to this. Vladimir Putin said, I will put my nuclear forces on high alert. Sergei Lavrov repeated that yesterday. And of course, we have this attack that has now been confirmed was shelled by Russians in a nuclear plant. The Europeans say this is now concerning on that front because there is no hint in any way that Russia plans to de-escalate. And I would also point to a speech yesterday by Vladimir Putin on Russian TV in which he said the operation will continue and our goal is to denazify the country. He repeated 10 times, we have to get rid of the Nazis that govern Ukraine.
Maria, Mr. Putin out with headlines right now. The headline, folks, is simple. Putin says he has no evil intent toward neighbors. We do understand, Maria, that the neighbors don't include Ukraine. Andrea Akostikov of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace writes in Foreign Affairs this morning of the news blackout to the Russian people. Maria, what is Brussels and others doing about informing the Russian people?